Hi, boys and girls. It's good to be with you today. And today I want to use our time together to teach you about baptism. Now, some of you recently have trusted Jesus and you've shared that with your parents and you've even shared it with the church. And usually the next step after you believe in Jesus is to be baptized. And so I want to talk to you today about what baptism is, what it means, and then we're going to have a class where we can all sit down together soon with your moms and dads if they want to be here and talk about it together, and you can ask questions. But today I want you to watch this with your moms and dads, and there's going to be some Bible verses you can talk about later. And I'm going to teach you a little bit about baptism today. So let me begin by using the New City Catechism to give us just a basic definition of baptism, okay? And you guys have this. Your moms and dads should have this on their phones or in a book, and they can work on this with you. But the New City Catechism says baptism is the washing with water in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It signifies and seals our adoption into Christ, our cleansing from sin, and our commitment to belong to the Lord and to his church. Now, that's a great thing to memorize, and there's a shorter version that some of you younger ones might want to memorize with mom and dad. But let me just talk to you for a little bit about what baptism is and what it means. Let's say, boys and girls, that I wanted to tell you a story. How could I do that? Well, the first way we're used to hearing and telling stories is by using words. So if I were to say to you, for example, once upon a time, you would know that what came after would be a story that I wanted to tell you. But are there also other ways to tell a story? Maybe I could use an object as an illustration. So for example, I have a piece of glass here that's really kind of strange looking, isn't it? It's kind of an odd shape. But there's a story behind this, and I could use this object to tell you a story about how this piece of glass was made and where it came from and what it means to me. I could use an object like that, or maybe I could tell you a story through a song or a poem. So if I were to say, for example, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. Well, that's the beginning of a poem that your moms and dads have probably heard, and maybe some of you have heard and know. Or you could begin singing a song that told a story. So there's a lot of different ways to tell a story. But there's another way to tell a story that you've maybe seen as well. And that is you could act out the story, like playing charades. So if you were playing a game where you had a word that you had to get across to the people you're playing with, but you couldn't use your mouth, you would act it out. You know, if you said it was windy one day, you might go, and you would act like the wind was blowing you away, and you would act it out in such a way that they could see what was going on. The story wouldn't use words at all. You just act it out, and the people who watch are familiar enough to know what it is you're trying to communicate. Well, baptism is just like that. Baptism is like telling a story by acting out something that has happened to you. Now, the question is, what is the story you're trying to tell? Okay, so let me show you a picture. I'm going to share my screen with you for just a minute, and let me show you a picture, and let me see if you could tell the story of this picture, okay? Hold on here while I pull this up. Okay, so here you have a picture, and I bet most of you boys and girls could see this picture and maybe this next one, and you could tell me the story of what's taking place here. Now, I'm going to show you some other pictures right now that I want you to remember in just a minute so we don't have to go back and forth. But think about these two pictures, and then look at these three others I want to show you as well. Now, these three pictures, the second set of three pictures are all different, but each of these tells a story. But just from those first two pictures I showed you, I'll bet you could tell me the story of the Exodus. Now, what is the story of the Exodus? Well, God's people were slaves in Egypt, and God sent Moses to tell Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to let his people go. His people were suffering because they were having to work as slaves, and they were very unhappy. And God said, I want you to let my people go. Now, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, refused. He said, I will not let these people go. So God sent plagues on Egypt. Remember, he did all sorts of things to them. He sent them frogs and flies, and the Nile River turned to blood. And eventually, he even killed all of the firstborn children and animals in Egypt. And finally, after that last plague, Pharaoh let God's people go. So all of Israel begins to leave Egypt with Moses as their leader. But after they're gone for a little while, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, changes his mind. And he says, you know what? I've changed my mind. I'm not going to let them go. Let's get our army together and go chase them down. And so that's what he does. He gets his army, and they get all their chariots and their horses, and they begin to chase down the people of Israel as they're fleeing. Now, Moses has all of these people that are depending on him. And when he looks back, Pharaoh and his armies are coming. But what's right in front of them? The Red Sea. They have this big body of water in front of them that they can't get across, so they're trapped. So what does God do? He opens up a way for them in the water. They go down under the water with the water standing on either side, and they walk through on dry land. They come out the other side. And once they're through, what happens when Pharaoh and his armies try to follow? Well, God drowns them. He lets the water fall back to where it was, and he drowns them in the Red Sea. So, what has happened in this story? Well, you've got God freeing his people from slavery and God judging the people who were abusing them by killing them with water. Now, can you remember other times in the Bible that God judged people by putting them under water? Well, you probably remember the story of Noah and the ark, right? The earth had become so wicked, God was going to judge the world. And so he sent the flood waters, and it killed everything on the world. But God saved Noah and his family and the animals by putting him in this ark of safety. How about the story of Jonah? You remember Jonah was supposed to go to Nineveh to preach, but he didn't want to do that because he didn't like the Ninevites. And so he tried to run from God. And eventually he winds up with some sailors. He jumps overboard. They throw him overboard because the storm is so bad. And God sends a whale or some large fish that he'd prepared, who swallows Jonah. And so Jonah is under the water, and then the animal eventually spits him up onto dry land. That was a judgment from God. So in the stories of the Exodus, the flood, God uses water to judge people because of their sins. Now in the Bible, water is often used to picture the judgment of God. Now, the Exodus and the flood, these are stories of God judging people for their sins by using water. But remember, these stories also show God's salvation because he saved his people by guiding them safely through the water. With Noah and the ark and Moses and the children of Israel going through the Red Sea, God saved his people even while he was judging the rest of the people there who were going under the water. Now, a long time after the flood and a long time after the Exodus, Jesus comes. And just as he's about to begin his public preaching ministry, he gets baptized. Now, why is this? Well, Jesus' baptism was telling a story. He was baptized to show that he was just like Israel. He was going to go through the waters of God's judgment and come out safely on the other side. Now, how is Jesus going to do that? Well, he wasn't going to go underwater literally. He was going to die on the cross. He was going to go under God's judgment. And then after that death, he was going to be what? Resurrected. And so Jesus, just like Israel, just like Noah, went through God's judgment and came out safely on the other side. Now, Israel, after they came out of the water, they were still sinful. They still did things that were wrong and displeased God. But Jesus wasn't. He went through the waters of God's judgment, not because he had sinned, but because we had sinned. He was going to go through the judgment of God for us. And Jesus' baptism pointed forward to the cross. So when you and I get baptized, when we go under the water all the way and come right back up, we're pointing back to Jesus's work on the cross for us. Jesus was dead. He was buried, and he was raised because he went through God's judgment for us. So when we get baptized, what we're saying is we are like Jesus. We have gone through God's judgment and come safely through because we've trusted in Jesus to take God's judgment for us and to save us. So, when we're in baptism, we're going through baptism by going under the water, we're telling a story. And we're doing it by acting it out. We act out that we have gone through the judgment of God, and we come out of the water showing that God has saved us from judgment. Now, we also tell the story in words, because when we're baptized, we also confess Jesus. We say to the people who are watching, I have trusted Jesus, and I believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and I trust Jesus to save me from my sins. So this is what baptism pictures. Now, baptism doesn't tell a story by just one picture. It actually tells several stories through different pictures. So I showed you the picture not only of the Exodus, but I showed you a picture of a child taking a bath, didn't I? You had this little boy, it looks like, in the bathtub. Well, that's one of the things that baptism pictures. And there's a Bible verse in Acts chapter 22, verse 16, that tells this. And I want you to look this verse up with your moms and dads and talk with them about it and see what this verse says. But baptism also pictures another picture that I showed you. I showed you a picture of a funeral, didn't I? All those people standing around in this coffin there, what we call the box that we put someone in after they die. And eventually, after the pastor says a few words, they'll put that coffin down in the ground and cover it over with dirt. Okay? Now that's a funeral. And Romans chapter 6, verses 3 through 5 tells us that baptism pictures this as well. Because remember, Jesus, after he was dead, after he died on the cross, he was buried. And then what happened on the third day? He was raised. He came back out of the tomb. So read Romans chapter 6, verses 3 and 5, and you'll see that picture with your moms and dads. It also shows us a picture of Jesus being on the cross. We show this story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection when we go through the waters of baptism. And what we're saying is that when Jesus died, we died too. Our judgment is in him. You can see that in Galatians 2:20. It's a very famous verse, and your moms and dads probably know that one, but you can look that one up and see it. And then finally, when we go through the waters of baptism, we picture ourselves being connected to Jesus. Galatians 3:27 tells us this. It's like putting on a shirt or putting on a coat. We're putting on Jesus so that he protects us, because he's gone through God's judgment for us, and he gives us his life. So baptism points to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus first and foremost. Baptism identifies me as somebody who's belonging to Jesus, because I'm connected to him through that death, burial, and resurrection. And baptism tells the world who we are. Now, one final thing here, boys and girls. You can only tell the story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection if this is something that has happened to you. If you have trusted Jesus and you look to him alone for your salvation, and you've repented of sin before God, and you understand that you need Jesus to save you by what he did on the cross, then you tell the world that you have done this through baptism and through telling others that you have trusted Jesus. So this is a really important story for us, boys and girls. It's a really important lesson. Jesus commanded us that as we go into all the world telling others about him, that we do so by baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So some of you may be ready for baptism before long, and in the coming days, we'll be having a class here in my office where we can all sit down together with moms and dads, and you can ask questions, and we'll talk about this again and make sure you really understand baptism. And then if you're ready, we will baptize you, okay? So I want you to spend some time with moms and dads talking about this, and we look forward to seeing you soon, okay? I love you, boys and girls, and I'll see you soon. God bless.